Hello and welcome to Perspectives with Neilo, the podcast where we go beyond the headlines to explore how geopolitics, foreign influence, economic security and political decision-making quietly shape our lives. I'm your host, Neil O'Sullivan. What happens when a strategically important factory in rural Ireland becomes part of a supply chain that ultimately supports Russia's war in Ukraine? That was the question raised by an Irish Times investigation published in March this year, which revealed how hundreds of thousands of tonnes of alumina produced at Aughinish Alumina in County Limerick were being exported to Russian smelters whose aluminium has gone on to supply companies linked to Russia's defence industry. The findings reignited an uncomfortable debate in Ireland. How did a strategically important industrial plant become owned by one of Russia's largest companies? Why are these exports still taking place despite years of EU sanctions? And what responsibilities do governments have when economic interests collide with national security and foreign policy? Aughinish Alumina was established by Aluminium in the 1970s before changing ownership several times, eventually becoming part of Rusal, the Russian aluminium giant with long-established links to the Kremlin. According to the Irish Times investigation, exports of alumina from Ireland to Russia have increased significantly in recent years, despite Russia's weakening civilian economy, with much of the refined aluminium ultimately entering supply chains serving Russia's military-industrial complex. Although the European Union has introduced multiple rounds of sanctions against Russia since its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, alumina remains outside the current sanctions regime. That has placed Ireland in an increasingly difficult position. Successive Irish governments have argued that sanctioning Aughinish could damage European industry more than Russia, while Ukraine has repeatedly expressed concern that materials originating in Ireland continue to reach Russia's defence sector. During his visit to Dublin for the launch of Ireland's European presidency in early July, President Zelensky warned that companies in Europe that keep supplying the aggressor with essential materials keep the war going. So, what should Ireland do? Is this simply an unintended consequence of global supply chains, or does it expose a much deeper vulnerability in how democratic countries have allowed authoritarian states to build economic influence over strategically important industries? Joining me to examine these questions is Dr Eoin McNamara, Postdoctoral Fellow in the Global Security and Governance Programme at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in Helsinki. Together we discuss what the Irish Times investigation revealed, how the story has been viewed across Europe, why alumina has not yet been sanctioned by the European Union, and the difficult political and ethical choices now facing the Irish government. We also explore the broader lessons for Ireland and Europe, what happens when foreign investment creates strategic dependency. How do authoritarian powers use economic relationships to build political leverage? And what should Ireland learn from the experience of Aughinish Alumina as it considers future investment from countries such as China? This is a conversation not just about one refinery in County Limerick, but about national resilience, economic security, and how democracies protect themselves in an increasingly uncertain world. So, Eoin, it's great to chat with you again. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you, Neil.
Yeah, so I know that you live and work in Finland and Estonia, and you have connections with Limerick and the Shannon Estuary too. So when it comes to the Aughinish Alumina story, you're in a pretty unique position there. And you wrote an op-ed on the Aughinish Alumina story for Estonian Daily Post Times recently. And coincidentally, in the Irish Times this morning, July 3rd, there's a story that Estonia have been pushing the EU to impose sanctions on alumina exports to Russia for more than a year and a half now. So I would imagine that people in Estonia and Europe are watching this story very closely.
Yeah, that op-ed originally came out published on the 12th of June, but it originally came out in the main Estonian daily is called Postimees. It would be like the Irish Times or the Irish Independent in Ireland, or the Times of London or the Guardian in the United Kingdom. It's the newspaper of record, and I suppose I've written for them before. I knew the op-ed the opinion editor. But I thought it was important to write that article because suddenly, I've never seen a story like it in the Baltic states. In a lot of the time I've spent here, in that someone you'd meet on the bus, or someone you'd meet in a cafe, or someone you'd meet on the street, people you'd know, neighbors. They mightn't be too interested in politics, but they all knew about this alumina refinery in Ireland that is reported to be supplying the weapons industry in Russia, going on reports earlier this spring. So I've never seen a story related to Ireland like that kind of permeates very broadly in the Baltic states. Ireland is normally, and Irish political issues are not normally covered here. But suddenly, after the reports of this spring, there's been a lot of interest in this and a lot of disappointment in Ireland surrounding these issues, if they are true. And it is true. I mean, Estonia has taken a very hard line on the need to sanction alumina. It is a vital metal that is used in many critical weapon systems for Russia. And their foreign minister, a man by the name of Margus Sokna, has been very, very outspoken on this. I would probably say on this particular issue related to sanctioning alumina going to Russia, that Margus Sokna, the Estonian Minister of Foreign Affairs, has been probably the most outspoken foreign minister in the European Union on this issue.
And I suppose, to give us some context on that, it's because of Estonia's proximity to Russia. Is this why people there would feel this way about this issue?
Yeah, I mean, the Estonians kind of look out for double standards, hypocrisies. I mean, I suppose they see their foreign policy as trying to get everyone in Europe on the same page in support of Ukraine, and trying to make sanctions on Russia as effective as possible. I mean, the war in Ukraine, I mean, from a Western perspective, it's a full-blown conflict from a Russian and from a Ukrainian perspective. But in terms of Western support for Ukraine, the context is limited. The war is limited because, of course, Russia is a nuclear armed power. The West can't intervene militarily directly. So we have to make the most effective use of the instruments we have, trying to influence Russian behavior and trying to contribute, eventually at least, to a fair, just and lasting peace in Ukraine. And, sanctions are key in this regard. They're a key instrument. They're not perfect. It can be very frustrating. They can be very slow. But these sanctions, they need to be as effective as possible. They need to essentially ensure that different aspects, different ingredients, if you will, different components that the European Union and the United States are serving Russia's war machine with, such as alumina, such as revenues that some European countries are paying out for Russian oil and gas, other technological components, that these supply chains dry up. And with that, Russia's war machine is weakened. And with that, Russia is forced into making concessions. It feels that hurting stalemate that all belligerents feel when they must turn to the negotiating table, and we must negotiate a fair, just and lasting peace in Ukraine. So I think the Estonian view right now, and alumina is very much on top of the list, that the sanctions aren't as hurting as they should be, and therefore they're not as effective as they might be. And this is why this issue has become very prominent in Estonian foreign policy discourse over this past spring.
And I mean, you mentioned the sanctions there. The EU has placed about 20 rounds of sanctions, I think, so far on Russia since the war started. I think the last round of sanctions was back in April. It's interesting that alumina has escaped being sanctioned so far, given it's so important to military hardware, right?
Yeah, I mean, when we mention, I mean, just briefly, when we mention kind of, hypocrisies or contradictions or double standards, I mean, they've had a few of these in Estonia as well. No one is perfect in this regard. I mean, we had the controversy with Kaja Kallas, her husband privately making money in the transit business, making a lot of money once upon a time before he divested after the controversy on the transit business to Russia in a kind of an area of transit to Russia that was unsanctioned. But it was seen here it wasn't morally correct that the husband of the prime minister was doing that. And of course, Kaja Kallas has gone on to become the EU foreign policy chief. We also have an issue here that the main boss, I mean, there's different levels of seriousness with these things. And alumina, given its critical role in weapons systems, is very serious. And I think we need to recognize that in Ireland. But say, for instance, here in the Baltic, in the Baltic states in Estonia, one of the main bus companies is making very, very large profits here since Finland shut the border, because the Estonian border is still open for transit across. So anyone wanting to get to Russia from this part of the world often takes public transport from Tallinn, St. Petersburg, on to Moscow, etc. But somehow from that, like, the bus company is now making millions in profits, one of the bus companies. But the Estonians, of course, don't want to shut the border, because of course that will be seen as something that could create tension in the east of the country, where a lot of Estonia's Russian speakers live. And of course, they have lots of Russian speakers can have some contacts with Russia. And of course, shutting that down could bring a lot of tension in Estonia. So from these type of things, there's a lot of inadvertent consequences going on. And we're seeing that in West Limerick. We're seeing that with Aughinish, and how Aughinish is interwoven in the social fabric of West Limerick. So to get to your question, yeah, I think we're on 21 sanctions packages right now, the 21st sanctions package from the European Union directed at Russia since Russia's escalated aggression in 2022. And yeah, alumina has stayed out of that for a number of reasons. I mean, of course, Ireland, when the United States wanted to sanction, they sanctioned Deripaska personally, Oleg Deripaska. He's the oligarch who, it is claimed, still controls Rusal, the company that owns Aughinish Alumina. But during that, I was going back to 2018, that sanctions were placed on Oleg Deripaska because of his proximity. He openly favors the Kremlin. But during that process, it was discussed or was contemplated by the United States principally, but also the European Union, to put sanctions on Rusal. And of course, that would have put the Aughinish plant in the eye of the storm. It didn't happen for a number of reasons. I mean, you can go back, there's open source material in the Irish media discussing, how our diplomats lobbied for this to be the case. But it's also a European supply chain issue, primarily. That's primarily why the European Union hasn't sanctioned that. Alumina supplies coming through Aughinish, that refinery, which is the largest in the European Union, are very much intertwined. So if you sanction one, aka Russia, on one hand, you will be harming the other. And of course, we live in a big or a serious or a significant cost of living crisis. Alumina is a vital metal, not just for military equipment, but for everything, for smartphones, for cookers, for saucepans, and for radiators, all of these things, when alumina is smelted into aluminium. So it will potentially, if there's a shock somewhere in the supply chain, and Aughinish is a key part of that supply chain, serving both EU markets and Russia. If there's a shock there, we'll see a huge spike in the price of alumina on the world market, and that will make the crisis or the cost of living crisis that bit much worse. Of course, it all starts with bauxite. That is the raw earth, the raw material that is brought to Aughinish from Guinea, from Brazil, to be refined into alumina, and then alumina is smelted into aluminium. But it's also a question what sort of arrangements does Rusal have with these mines in Guinea and in Brazil? What sort of contracts? How loyal are those running these mines to Rusal? And will these mines, if we're talking about repositioning or rediverting supply chains away from Russia and keeping the Aughinish plant open, can the European Union do business with these mines, or is it a very murky world where they prefer the Russians, perhaps even backed up by the Chinese? So there's a lot of complexity here, and Aughinish is only one link in a very complex chain.
That's very interesting, the background and complexity of the supply chain. But you probably know that on July 1st, Ireland took the presidency of the European Union. Ukrainian President Zelensky was in Dublin, and he gave a speech. And even though he didn't mention Aughinish Alumina directly in the speech, he did continue to push for, making it harder for Russia to continue the war. And he said about sanctions against Russia that companies in Europe that keep supplying the aggressor with essential materials keep the war going. So clearly putting pressure there on the Irish government in terms to do something. And we hear from the Irish government that there's a report or some assessment in the works by the Department of Enterprise. Do you think this is part of the assessment, this looking at the supply chain and all the dependencies and the potential impact of whatever decision is taken?
Yeah, I would assume so, Neil. Yeah, so I think Zelensky is correct, because there's no point in levying sanctions half-heartedly. You've got to ensure that you harm the aggressor, and critical things that the aggressor needs. If you have those under your control, which alumina we have, it's a very complicated issue, because European Union, we have some leverage over it, but Rusal has some leverage over it, as I mentioned, and Russian markets. And then the mines for bauxite in Guinea and Brazil, they have something to say on this question as well. So as I mentioned, it's highly complex, and I would assume, they've announced this report and they've done it very, very quickly. So I'd have questions on how thorough it might be. I'd also have questions. There's been a lot of leaks in the Irish media around this, a lot of leaks. But they've discussed how the Department of Enterprise will need, and they put it in inverted commas, boots on the ground. They'll need information from the ground in the Russian Federation. And I would be very, 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 very skeptical as to whether they will get accurate information about smelting plants and supply chains, east of the Urals. Mightn't that, gaining information to that degree mightn't be the forte or mightn't be the normal modus operandi of the Irish Department of Enterprise. But they need some report that will get the facts straight. This is what Kaya Kallas said a number of weeks ago when she was in Dublin ahead of the Irish EU presidency. She's the EU's foreign and security policy chief, that she trusted Ireland to get the facts straight around this. But there is urgency there because this is a very, very serious problem. Alumina is at the very, very high end of seriousness. You can't make bombs. You can't make Iskander missiles that the Russians have. You can't make armored personnel vehicles. All these, I suppose, bread and butter, lifeblood forms of equipment for the Russian military. You cannot make without alumina and aluminium. And of course, the Russian military, if the reports are true, I think the reports are very, very convincing. In that regard, the largest refinery in Europe, sending 600,000, 800,000 tons of aluminium or alumina to Russia by now. I don't think it should be too much of a surprise. Actually, my only surprise is that we were surprised in Ireland because, since midway in 2022, Russia has been a war economy. So if you're where the civilian economies and the war economies are very much intertwined. So if you're exporting this amount of alumina to an economy of that nature, I don't think anyone should be surprised. It should be obvious that a lot of that raw material or that refined material rather is going into the military industry. So I mean, it is something very, very important, a very, very important component that's keeping the Russian military alive on the battlefield in Ukraine, most likely. And, it's a shock to Ireland because we don't, all the facts are there or all the indications are there, and the facts will be there soon we hope, from this Department of Enterprise report. But in our kind of national consciousness, we don't really see the larger geopolitics around these things. We see Aughinish and the employment it provides in West Limerick, its contribution to the community there, but we don't really tend to think beyond that in Ireland. This is a real test, I think.
Yeah, and as you mentioned in your op-ed, all politics is local. So definitely the local impact on the jobs in the Limerick area is looming large for the Irish government. I did want to ask you though about, and it's a complex situation, as you said. Is it possible for Rusal, or given that they're a Russian company, and as you mentioned, Oleg Deripaska is rumored to be close to Putin or has close connections with Putin? Is there a potential here for Russia to make things difficult for Ireland in this, as this all plays out?
Yes, most definitely. I mean, they've been again, there's been a lot of leaks. I think Conor Gallagher in the Irish Times has done absolutely fantastic work on this, on both on the original report that came out in collaboration with other European journalists, and indeed the leaks that have followed. The plant gives back excess electricity. That's enough to power 200,000 Irish homes. And of course, we know electricity prices in Ireland very high. We've security supply issues. The Irish grid often comes under pressure. So Aughinish is actually very, very important in that regard. It also, the plant also swallows up a very, very large percentage of Irish gas. So it gives and it takes. So we've seen in the leaks that, it can be kind of inferred from a lot of them that Aughinish and its directors and its senior management have a very close line with the government and are very interested and very used to lobbying the government. And I think, there's a lot of support in the community for Aughinish, and local politicians feel that as well. So we talk about Oleg Deripaska. I'm not even sure Deripaska's been to Ireland. And I often say, the Russians aren't 10 feet tall. I mean, sometimes in the Baltic states, there is a tendency to see them as unstoppable or indestructible or the master string pullers that never make mistakes. But of course, the Russians, we've seen this in Ukraine, the Russians and Ukraine policy, the Russians make a lot of mistakes. But why I mention this is, if we look at Aughinish Alumina, if I was being slightly conspiratorial, going back to when Deripaska and Rusal took over the plant in 2007, it's almost the perfect way to create a protracted problem. If you understand Irish politics, in the sense that you go in there, you save the plant. The previous, very much, I mean, I'm from Waterford, but very much I've a lot of family exactly in that region. My mother comes from just beyond Foynes there. But if you were to pick an aspect of Irish politics to create a protracted problem and create this kind of painful dependency we've discussed, it would almost be a perfect place politically. I mean, Deripaska went in there, as I mentioned, in 2007 when the plant was struggling. Its parent company was Glencore from Canada, and it was struggling. It looked like there was going to be layoffs, redundancies. Rusal took over the plant, and Rusal are celebrated. Thank you. People of West Limerick were only too happy because we know, I mean, there's 400, 500 jobs directly employed at the plant, but there's about 1,500 if you add on contractors in the local area. And of course, those who indirectly supply the plant. And of course, Askeaton, the nearest town, is under pressure because of the closure of the Nestle factory. There's not too much employment around elsewhere in that part of Limerick. So Rusal's investment was very, very welcome. I mean, Rusal very involved in the local community there, sponsoring things like the GAA. So Aughinish is very much interwoven with what matters most in the local social fabric. So if the Russians were to pick a place where you can create this protracted problem, where there's a lot of political pushback on any moves to nationalize the plant or take the plant fully into European control, which mightn't necessarily be a silver bullet, but it gets us out of the moral and strategic predicaments that we have now, in the sense that we're supporting Ukraine politically, we're sending billions in aid in the European Union to Ukraine, but at the same time, inadvertently, we're also supporting the other side with alumina exports that are critical to its military machine. So, that's not good morals and it's not good strategy. But as I've said before, tell many of the local people in West Limerick that who simply want to keep their jobs, tell people involved in the local economy, down there, all of this is very, very important. And the last thing I'll say on this is it's very, very important that Ireland, when this report that we mentioned from the Department of Enterprise is furnished to the Commission, and if the Commission want to sanction, it's very important that Ireland works very closely, and I'm sure they will, with the European Union to try and find alternatives for the plant and to redistribute its supply chains elsewhere, because it means some short-term pain, and there are risks to employment that should be mitigated with Irish government and EU support. But there are other options on the world alumina markets that are there if we can take that short pain. But of course, the politics and the political around this, risk around this, are very, very entrenched in the Irish context.
But to go back to the point you made there, which I think is very interesting, of how the local community would have been delighted when Deripaska took over the plant in the mid 2000s there, but maybe government was a little naive or short-sightedness, and some might say what you're saying is conspiracy theory. They might view it as conspiracy theory, but isn't it a known principle for those waging hybrid interference that when you create dependencies, you're in a position you can leverage these later, and sometimes very strategically. And so, do you think the Irish government is learning a lesson here in terms of what other engagements they might take part in with regimes that mightn't be that they mightn't be very scrupulous?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm trying to kind of play on the conspiracy point. I'm trying to kind of play devil's advocate with myself. That it's sometimes it's hard to know Russia at times, and we've seen this, I've gone on some of your other podcasts before, in the Baltic Sea, a lot of the undersea damage. I mean, there's huge debates in Northern Europe between intelligence services as to how much of this has been purposely targeted in the Baltic Sea, all these cable cuttings. How much of that has been purposely targeted and how much of that has been accidental through poor seamanship? But yeah, I've said this, I think, before. Yeah, that is definitely a principle of hybrid interference or negative interdependence, as it's called as well. That you create a dependency, and then you seek at some point in the future to leverage that dependency later on. So if we kind of rewind back to 2007, I wrote in that op-ed that, Vladimir Putin never ruled out the return of geostrategic competition with the West, whereas the West saw all this, Russia having some investment in the European Union, some economic integration in the European Union. This can only be good to build peace and to build cooperation. But the Russians and dare I say also the Chinese in the background might not see things in this way. But on Aughinish specifically, I mean, if they wanted to exploit a dependency 20 years on, I mean, they got a very, very good one there. It's almost like if they were trying this 20 years ago, if they thought that this would pay not just economic dividends for Rusal and Deripaska's fortune, but for Russia strategically, I mean, they've almost hit every category with their strategic aim there. They're getting critical material out of this for their war machine. They've got a place that's protected very, very deeply and very, very emotionally in terms of Ireland's local politics. They've got a wider European intertwined security supply network around it that the Europeans are finding very, very, very hard to dismantle. You've got a very ambivalent Irish government on these matters that likes putting its head in the sand and kicking its can down the road. It's one of the reasons that, despite, as we've seen from leaks, government concerns that this issue was going to become a very big issue. We've seen leaks talking or mentioning government documents about this a few years ago. But of course, the Irish natural reflex was to say nothing, and this problem might blow over, and we won't open the Pandora's box in West Limerick with Aughinish, which would be very, very, very costly in Irish politics, considering some of the other problems we have in Ireland with housing, cost of living, things like that. So, it's almost like, the Russians can be very strategic, but they can be opportunistic. But they got, in terms of their, strategic preferences at the current time, in terms of all the entanglement there that I've mentioned, that Rusal's acquisition of Aughinish Alumina has given the Russians and Russian strategy a lot of joy over recent years. And of course, the way Irish politics and its economy is configured, inadvertently wasn't the Irish intent, inadvertently assisted that, and has allowed Aughinish to remain unsanctioned for this long, which is quite surprising, and has kept those alumina supplies going into Russia.
We'd like to take a moment to thank you for tuning in to Perspectives with Neilo. Our mission is to shine a spotlight on important topics like this one, issues that often go underreported but truly deserve your attention. But to continue bringing these important topics to you, we need your help. If you're enjoying the podcast or finding value in our discussions, the best way to support us is by subscribing or following us on your favorite podcast app. Unfortunately, many of our listeners aren't subscribed yet, and your support can make a huge difference. Join us in raising awareness. Subscribe now and help us keep the conversation going. And thank you in advance for your support. Coming up, we hear from Dr Eoin McNamara about how other potential dependencies in different sectors of Ireland's economy may inadvertently expose the country in future or endanger the European Union's security strategy. But first, we hear how refineries like Aughinish in other parts of the world have already taken steps to curtail alumina exports to Russia while continuing to operate successfully.
Just 2 points. One is I mentioned that there's other alternatives out there if we can take the original shock to the supply chain. I mean, Australia in 2022, it sanctioned its alumina exports to Russia, and its refinery, which is a very large refinery down in Australia, it was supplying, that refinery was supplying 20% at the time. Russia's alumina imports were coming in from Australia. I mean, 20% of them, and that plant in Australia is still going because it was able to redivert the supply chains it was involved in. There's still huge demand for alumina on the global market. So when things are tweaked, when things are adapted, I know there's some short-term pain, but there are possibilities on the global market that bypass Russia. And of course, Rusal and Aughinish are, I know, European. They supply Europe as well. That's part of the issue. That's part of the problem. But one of the reasons Rusal and Aughinish are so focused on Russian markets is because it is a Russian company. And further down the supply chain, it's that the smelters there along the Urals, east of the Urals in Russia, these large smelters there are also owned by Rusal. So it makes commercial sense from a Rusal perspective for Aughinish to have this Russian priority. So that's why. But if we take Rusal out of the equation, which will cause a shock, no doubt, early on, there are opportunities, given the demand for alumina, for Aughinish to be involved in broader global supply chains and for the plant to grow and to prosper potentially under new ownership that doesn't have the same regressive geopolitical morals or strategic disadvantages of the current arrangement. Now, and so there are alternatives there. And just the last point, yeah, I mean, these days, I mean, we're talking about hard, heavy industry, and I mean, if you've been there, my grandparents are buried there in the cemetery just across the Shannon from Aughinish, Relic Mhuire in Askeaton there. And you know, when you look across from that cemetery in Askeaton, it provides provides a very interesting vantage point on Aughinish and Aughinish Peninsula. That you see hard and heavy industry at work, a lot of pollution. But when we talk about these dependencies, and particularly when China and its role in Ireland and its investment in Ireland come into the equation, when we talk about future dependencies and future issues relating to Ireland, the European Union, European securities, and potentially China using these dependencies over us, I don't think we'll be talking about hard and heavy industry and big chimneys pumping out a lot of toxins, unfortunately, in West Limerick. I think we'll be talking about the software economy and software platforms and the investments of Finnish big tech in Ireland and in Dublin and things like that, and you know, Ireland's facilitation of that and the European effort to de-risk from China in terms of software being produced, and indeed even those who are involved in manufacturing the software. You know, Ireland and other EU countries, we need FDI, we need foreign direct investment. And in Ireland currently, we're a bit naive on China. We see China as an important investor, and we see China politically as a country we can do business with, we can manage. we appreciate its FDI, its foreign direct investment. But Ireland's a small country. I mean, we don't always have the graduate profile for computer engineers, programmers, other parts that connect us to China. So we need talent from around the world, including China as well. So, Chinese people, Chinese graduates coming to Ireland to work for Chinese companies. The issue with this is now that there is an intelligence risk perceived around this. And I'm seeing this in the Baltic states and in Finland as well, that there is now a vetting system is now being, evolved in this regard. Vetting and security clearance, it used to simply be for government officials, particularly government officials who handle state secretive information. But I'm seeing it in the Baltic states now. I'm seeing it in Finland. It's part of the de-risking process with China that vetting is now, say in Finland, and security clearance is now being required of those who work with critical infrastructure and in the private sector. If you're a contractor working for a major building company involved in these projects, you still have to go through the state security clearance system. Vetting, as we kind of say in Ireland. This is the way, say Finland, Baltic states, Sweden, some others, the security savvy states in Europe. This is how they are managing de-risking, aware of China's hybrid strategy, right, potentially aware of the dependencies that China could create. This is a way of managing the dependencies. So in Ireland, we're, in terms of security clearance, in terms of vetting, we're way behind. But we are very, very integrated in terms of our FDI with Chinese tech. So if China has malign intent, then we're very much giving China a window to build up these dependencies now, whereas other countries, I wouldn't say they're clamping down on it necessarily, but they're putting the systems in place to de-risk. So we're behind the curve there in Ireland again, and lots of people have been saying this. I mean, Ed Burke has had some op-eds, excellent op-eds in the Irish Times recently, Dr. Ed Burke from UCD. So to kind of finalize on that, it might be Aughinish now in terms of the dependencies and the protracted problems we're seeing. In terms of our, it's damaging European Union's security strategy. It's damaging the European Union's moral standing in the world, but it mightn't be hard, heavy industry in the future. It might well be connected to the software economy. But, the idea of dependence and how you de-risk from that dependence is the same. And in Ireland, we need to take the lessons of Aughinish. We need to sort out the problem of Aughinish first. We need to take the lessons of it and make sure we're not found out like we have been found out here again in the future, because these threats are only building across different sectors of the economy.
Yeah, I mean, as I listen to you there describe what is the entanglement, as you called it, between Rusal and the local community, it's amazing to me that how much of this entanglement could be happening already with China, because so many Chinese tech companies here, but we also hear about China in investing in the GAA through the International Investor Programme, the IIP, which was so controversial and stopped by the government. But I think the other layer there that comes to mind is, a recent report from a German think tank mentions that, Ireland is likely to increase its green tech cooperation, particularly solar and wind energy, with China on foot of Micheál Martin's visit there last January. But we also hear from other experts in the world about, the security risk of things like kill switches in Chinese power inverters and so on, and the whole risk of all of that. And so that's the whole question, I suppose, about the lessons learned is, are politicians just too short-sighted, or what, to kind of actually take some meaningful action on what might be the lessons learned from the likes of Aughinish Alumina?
Yeah, I've always thought of Ireland, and this might be changing a little bit now, but I've always thought about Ireland in terms of psychology, in terms of the mindset. We're more a geoeconomic nation than we are a geopolitical nation in terms of our outlook. And I mean, that kind of that mindset really, the way we spoke about foreign policy, and trade was interlinked very closely with foreign policy. I mean, it's Helen McEntee, the current foreign minister and defense minister. She's also the minister of foreign affairs. I think her official title is Minister of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Defense, which most Europeans would think would be quite an unusual combination. So what I'm putting to here is, yeah, and after the economic crisis, 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, we saw foreign policy in terms of, say our network of embassies. We saw that the only point in opening an embassy, it wasn't for any geopolitical or security reason. It was to serve Ireland's trade interests, open up consulates maybe in different places, embassies in different places. That was really the priority. I remember reading a great article by Dennis Staunton, again in the Irish Times, about this at the time. And for my own research, trying to highlight this point, I've been trying to find that article for many years online, and I just can't get the key words right. So we tend to see, I mean, we saw Aughinish through a geoeconomic lens, or even not even a geoeconomic lens, a local economic lens. And when you mention, China, I mean, and we go back to the economic crash in Ireland after 2008. I remember, I mean, when Xi was the deputy, was the second in command essentially in the CCP. He was on the rise. He hadn't risen to president yet. But I remember, the headlines in Ireland thinking, that this is good news for Ireland and the good news for our economy, that Xi is in Ireland. And, we were only one of maybe 2 EU countries that the Chinese visited. And, we had, around the same time, remember Micheál Martin's unfortunate comments about the Chinese government thinking the Irish economy was very good at producing software. So we had this bit of a love-in with China, with Chinese investment. We thought within the European Union in Ireland that we were particularly well placed to gain this investment. It's all been led by investment and geoeconomics. At the same time, I mean, you mentioned China and the GAA there, and kind of trying to support the GAA, or trying to be associated with the GAA's brand. I mean, we saw, when G came to Ireland those times, he was seen pucking a ball around in Croke Park. And the Irish attitude, well, isn't this great? Sure, look at him. Maybe he could line out left corner forward for Kilkenny. All these kind of jokes. And later on, the Chinese were interested to be associated, as I mentioned, with the GAA's brand. But there's not too much talk about China's rise, China's geopolitics, what China will look like in a world of great powers 20 years from now. I mean, that's what they would be talking about in Finland, in the Nordic countries. What are the risks? So when you mention these technologies, green technologies, solar panels, things like that, this is where future dependencies will arise, and where future geopolitical leverage will arise. And when these things, I know Ireland, we're waking up to it now, but when this critical infrastructure is being planned, these geopolitical risks for Ireland and into the future aren't really being absorbed or being contemplated. We tend, at least up until recently, we tended to look very naively on these things. So that's critical infrastructure. And what I mentioned before, I think, is important. The European Union talks about de-risking with China. We don't really know. We're cautious, we're anxious about China in the European Union. But right now, China is very quiet. It's got the posture of do not interrupt your enemies when your enemies are making a mistake. So the European Union putting a lot of resources, and the wider West, the United States, putting a lot of resources into Ukraine. Russia, which is currently China's friend, it is bleeding itself dry in Ukraine as well, which essentially will give China dominance over Eurasia, unquestioned dominance over Eurasia, the weakening of Russia. I think that's a big part of Chinese strategy. But for Ireland, as we look on at this, I mean,
sorry to interrupt you,
yes,
Owen, but I think Russia are, in a way, supporting China. I mean, Kaja Kallas said this also, that, China has been training Russian troops for deployment in the war against Ukraine. And we also hear about the supply chain of dual-use items for use in Russia's military campaign. And so, I mean, we don't discuss that much here in Ireland, but if you watch the European news, then you hear it. But I wonder, are we not just aware of the role China is playing? I mean, would Russia be as successful as it is, or would it be able to hold its ground as it's holding its ground in the war in Ukraine if it didn't have that support from China buying its oil and backing it up with supply chain materials?
China's a friend. China's a friend. I mean, essentially, I mean, the answer to your question is, China currently supports Russia very, very significantly. But I mean, China's a friend I wouldn't want, because I know China in 10 years and 15 years will be using these dependencies potentially against me, to exploit and extract what it wants from me. So this is very, despite all the cordial language between Xi and Putin, and this limitless friendship, China is very transactional in terms of using partnerships to serve its long-term aims. I think China's very, very long-term. As I mentioned, they've kind of got this posture currently: do not interrupt your enemies as they are making mistakes. So this war in Ukraine is very, very good news for China, because it takes all the attention off the previous strategy. If you talk about the United States, the pivot to Asia, that was big 10 years ago. But now the United States, Trump is trying to balance, but the United States is still partially occupied with issues around Europe, and the European Union is completely occupied with issues about securing its continent, which takes a lot of the focus away from China. But yes, President Alexander Stubb once famously said, and he claimed afterwards, it was quite hyperbolically, that China could end the war in Ukraine with one phone call, that Xi could end it with one phone call to Putin. And of course, telling him in that phone call that China is cutting its supplies of dual-use technology, and it's not buying any more Russian oil if Russia doesn't end its war of aggression. Of course, Stubb was asked about this later on, and asked about his meeting with Xi recently, and they said they both laughed about that. And Xi told him that, it's a bit more complicated than that, but there was maybe some irony in that statement as well, going by the account I've seen Stubb discuss. But anyway, all of that is the grand geopolitical picture. But when we come back to solar panels and critical infrastructure and the green transition linking Ireland and China, I mean, I think we should be more savvy, like the Baltic states and like Finland, that if there are these big projects involving Chinese investment, they need to be de-risked. And those working on them need to be vetted. Need to have security guarantees, or not security guarantees, security clearance, to ensure that that's all they're doing, that they are building critical infrastructure that will then be under independent Irish ownership or independent Irish authority into the future, and there won't be any catches designed to leverage Ireland geopolitically. You mentioned kill switches or other issues in that regard. So, I mean, as I mentioned, in terms of security clearance, in terms of this form of de-risking, Ireland is behind some of the Nordic and Baltic countries, well behind in that regard. As these countries innovate and evolve, Ireland is still stuck somewhere in the last century when it comes to security clearance, intelligence and counterintelligence, and the institutions around that. So we're paying for the last 30 years of not developing these systems like our European neighbours properly. And, you know, there's a mismatch in terms of the economy and the FDI we want and how that needs to be secured.
That's Dr Eoin McNamara from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in Helsinki. My sincere thanks to Eoin for sharing his valuable insights with us on Perspectives with Neilo. On July 8th, the European Parliament passed a non-binding vote calling for a ban on the export of all alumina to Russia, a result that increases the pressure on the Irish government in relation to Aughinish Alumina. Irish MEPs from Fine Gael, Labour and Sinn Féin, including Independent Luke Ming Flanagan, voted in favour of the call to ban alumina exports to Russia, while 4 Fianna Fáil MEPs abstained, with 2 independents voting against it. As regards the Department of Enterprise report, which we spoke about during the interview, the Irish government has not yet provided a specific date for release, only saying that it will be available within a number of weeks. We've placed links to additional information on the topics covered in this episode in the Dive Deeper section of our blog, and you can check it out at pwneilo.com. That's pwneilo.com. We'd also love to hear your feedback on this discussion. Can a neutral country continue hosting strategically important industries owned by hostile states when those industries become entangled, legally or indirectly, in modern warfare? Drop us a comment on our Perspectives with Neilo social media pages or whichever app you use to listen to the podcast. You can also contact us via our blog at pwneilo.com. And if you enjoyed this episode and don't want to miss any future episodes, don't forget to hit that subscribe or follow button. This is the best way to support us and really helps motivate us to keep producing content. But that's where we leave it for now. Thank you for listening, and until the next time, Slán agus beannacht.